Hi, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Another warm day here in Adelaide. It's a Monday and I've got the air conditioning on in here, so it's quite pleasant in here. It's not, I suppose it's not common, although it may be more common than we think. When you dive back into your past, into your ancestors in your family, there may be some famous people, there may be some notorious people, and there may be some people we're not proud of. But I made a startling discovery about my roots, or some of them, when I was probably about 11. And it reminds me of that scene in the movie The Titanic, when the older Rose has got all these people enraptured reminiscing about her time on the Titanic and the adventures she had and all that sort of stuff. And they're all sort of hanging spellbound. I had a moment a bit like that many years ago when I was about 11. My grandmother was a lady called Lucy Buck, and she was married to William George Buck, Bill Buck, who was my grandfather on my mum's side. And Lucy Buck was a First World War, what we call English war bride. My grandfather was a digger, Australian soldier, who went to Europe and fought in the First World War and was stationed in England. And he met my grandmother there, and they married. They had a child there before they came back to Australia. Had two more children. The first one was a son, and then there was my mum and her sister, or my mum was the youngest. Anyway, my grandmother was just a lovely, quiet English lady, and very gentle, but the sort of grandma that whenever you were leaving her house, she'd slip a five shilling coin in your pocket without telling anyone to give you a little treat. And she was just wonderful. Very gracious, quiet Christian lady, actually. Anyway, one day I was in this spare room in her house, and I was always going through the drawers in the house because there were all sorts of curios and things that I could find going a long way back. I was going through it one day, and she come in and she said, "I want to show you something, Jeff." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "Here, read this newspaper article." It was a very old article out of some sort of an English newspaper, and it was talking about the awarding of the Longitude Prize to John Harrison. I don't know how many of you know the story of John Harrison and the Longitude Prize. They made a mini-series out of it. And I'm going to put some links underneath where I think you can watch it on YouTube, the whole series. I think it stars Jeremy Irons. Anyway, she told me that this John Harrison, she was related to, and he was like a sort of a great-great-great-great-grandfather. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting story. And it wasn't until years later when I come across this book by Dava Sobel, called Longitude, which was made into the mini-series, and I read it and I was enthralled. I read it from cover to cover in one sitting, I think. And basically, to give you some idea, I'll read a little bit out of that book and I'll show you something else in a minute. But basically, the idea was that it was easy enough to read latitude at sea, when this is in the days of the early sailing ships, and it was easy enough to read latitude at sea but not longitude. And to read longitude, you had to have a very accurate timepiece, a timekeeper at sea. And of course, all the clocks up until that time, back in the days before Captain Cook and the early explorers who discovered Australia and other places around the world on sailing ships, a lot of them ended up getting shipwrecked because they couldn't navigate properly. And to solve this problem, they needed to, the Longitude Society, I think it was called, in England, offered a very substantial prize, and I'll put all links to this underneath, something like about £20,000, I think, which would be worth a lot of money in these days, to anyone who could invent and produce an accurate timepiece that could measure time at sea. And many people took up the challenge. Dava Sobel brilliantly brings it out in her book, all the different quack-type remedies that people were coming up with. But this clockmaker in England, he came up with, he was a carpenter actually originally, and I read a little bit from the book, but he actually eventually won the prize, and it took some time, and his son took up the mantle when he was getting a bit too old to do it. and eventually was awarded the prize. And I've got a birth certificate here for my grandmother, which shows the connection of her mother to the Harrison name, even though she married later and changed her surname to Batty, I think it was. And she must have married again. I don't remember what happened with the actual marriage, the first marriage, or what happened, or someone died, or whatever. But the Harrison name is clearly there on my grandmother's birth certificate. I have no other way of verifying the story other than that I trust my grandmother totally, and I looked at that birth certificate, and when I read the story I thought, yeah, this all makes a lot of sense. And I've been spreading the word about the Longitude Prize ever since. I'll read a little bit here from about why it was needed. As the world turns, any line drawn, this is what Davis Sobel's saying in her book, and there's a really lovely illustrated book I'll show you in a minute of the same story. Where are we? As the world turns, any line drawn from pole to pole may serve as well as any other for a starting line of reference. The placement of the prime meridian is a purely political decision. All you scientists out there will get into this. Here lies the real hardcore difference between latitude and longitude. Beyond the superficial difference in line direction that any child can see, the 0-degree parallel of latitude is fixed by the laws of nature, while the 0-degree meridian of longitude shifts like the sands of time. This difference makes finding latitude child's play and turns the determination of longitude, especially at sea, into an adult dilemma, one that stumped the wisest minds of the world for the better part of human history. And you need to get a copy of the book yourself and read it yourself. It's a fascinating book. In fact, I'll read the back of it. It says, Longitude is the dramatic human story of an epic scientific quest. The longitude problem was the thorniest dilemma of the 18th century. Lacking the ability to measure longitude, sailors throughout the great ages of exploration had been literally lost at sea. At the heart of Davis Sobel's fascinating brief history of astronomy, navigation and horology stands the figure of John Harrison, self-taught Yorkshire clockmaker, and his 40-year obsession with building the perfect timekeeper. Excuse me. Battling against the establishment, Harrison stood alone in pursuit of his solution and the £20,000 reward offered by Parliament. And there's all sorts of endorsements of the book. It's a fascinating book and a fascinating story. There is also the illustrated Longitude, which I've got a copy of. And this is it's the text of the original book, but it's got all sorts of illustrations in it. I think there might be a picture of John Harrison. There he is. That's my ancestor, so I believe. Whoops, where are we like that? Come back a bit. That's John Harrison, the illustrated Longitude. And it's an absolutely fascinating story, and this is a beautiful edition. And it's got pictures of the clocks, and you can actually go and see these clocks in Greenwich Village in England. And in fact, they brought out a what do I do with that one there? Here, they brought out a stamp series some years ago about John Harrison. These are the stamps about the clocks. I got this from my auntie, I think, years ago, who was the oldest daughter, the older sister of my mum. And this tells you the whole story of the Longitude Prize, and it's a fascinating story. John Harrison had been interested in clockmaking from when he was a child in Barrow, Lincolnshire. He was trained by his father as a joiner, and it is no surprise that his first three clocks, 1713, 1715 and 1717, were made almost completely of wood. One of the interesting things that comes out in the book is that he used wood that was self-lubricating, that had oil in it, and therefore you didn't need to oil the mechanisms. And he's credited with being the inventor of the chronometer, really, which is where our wristwatches came from, because he set up a series of springs that would operate not through a pendulum, and that was really quite revolutionary. That's why he won the prize. I'll just quickly show you the birth certificate somewhere here. Yeah, that's the original birth certificate that we've got here, or a copy of it anyway, and it clearly shows here that my grandmother's mother was Mary Emily Batterley, formerly Harrison. That's the Harrison connection. And this is about 1895 that was issued. There you go. So it's a fascinating story. Watch the mini-series if you've never seen it before. Just wonderful. And whenever I get a chance to tell anyone about the Longitude Prize and my ancestor, I do. So I hope you found that interesting. Look up the links I'll put underneath to this and follow the story of Longitude. And it's really rather interesting because Captain Hook, not Captain Hook, he was in Peter Pan, Captain Cook, who was the terrific explorer that really put Australia on the map, he had these variations of these clocks in his ships when he came to discover Australia and circumnavigate Australia. And he, I don't know whether he circumnavigated, Matthew Flinders is our other great explorer. But anyway, if it hadn't have been for those clocks, he might never have come here, and we might never have been, I might not have even existed, because it would have been a different time when Australia was populated. So there you go. So it's a fascinating history. I'm sure lots of you have got fascinating stories in your family history as well, and it's always fun to look into it, isn't it? So thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you wish, and I'll see you next time.